Mel Gibson has called his new film an acid trip. Not a metaphor, not a joke for the cameras. His actual description of the script for The Resurrection of the Christ, the long-awaited sequel to The Passion of the Christ. He has said that to tell this story properly, you have to start with the fall of the angels, not the empty tomb, not Mary Magdalene finding the stone rolled away. The fall of the angels. He has talked about descending into hell, about fallen angels, about a structure so unusual that even he seemed unsure how audiences would take it. And here is the strange part. None of that is in the four Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John tell the resurrection story in plain terms. Jesus dies, is buried, the tomb is empty, he appears to his followers, and he ascends. No fallen angels. No descent into hell as a centerpiece. No cosmic battlefield. So where is this coming from? It turns out there is a version of the Bible, still read every single day by millions of people, that has been quietly preserving exactly the kind of imagery Gibson is talking about for over 1,000 years. It is called the Ethiopian Bible, and once you understand what is actually inside it, Gibson's strange vision stops sounding invented and starts sounding like something much older than Hollywood. Most people who grew up around Christianity have a mental picture of what the Bible contains, and that picture is smaller than they think. Protestant Bibles hold 66 books. Catholic and Orthodox Bibles hold 73, adding texts like Tobit, Judith, and the 2 books of Maccabees. But the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions on the planet, uses a canon of around 81 books, and the extra material is not filler. It includes the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Ascension of Isaiah, and several other texts that were once widely read across the early Christian world, and then, over time, quietly dropped everywhere else. These were not obscure fringe writings. The Book of Enoch is directly quoted in the New Testament letter of Jude. Early Christian writers like Tertullian and Irenaeus treated it as legitimate. For a while, it stood on roughly equal footing with texts that eventually made it into the official Bible. Ethiopia converted to Christianity in the 4th century, and because of its geography and its independence from the political and theological battles playing out in Rome and Constantinople, it never went through the centuries of canon narrowing that shaped the Bible most Western readers know. Monks there kept copying these older texts by hand, generation after generation, in the ancient language of Guizi, while the rest of Christendom slowly filtered them out. The Jesus described in those preserved texts does not look like the Jesus most people picture. Ask someone raised on Sunday school art to describe Jesus, and you will usually get some version of the same image. Gentle, calm, a shepherd carrying a lamb, kind eyes, soft features. The picture that Renaissance painters spent centuries perfecting. That image is not wrong, but it is incomplete, and the Book of Enoch shows you what got left out. In it, a figure called the Son of Man is described sitting on a throne of glory, judging the deeds of both humans and angels, holding a kind of authority that goes far beyond a wandering teacher from Nazareth. The language is not gentle. It is closer to something you would expect from an apocalypse than a bedtime story. A being whose presence carries weight, whose judgment weighs every hidden thing, who has been given preeminence before God himself. The Ascension of Isaiah, another text preserved in the Ethiopian canon, goes even further, describing a figure whose glory is so overwhelming that even angels bow down and worship him on sight. This is not a humble carpenter. This is something closer to what shows up in the book of Revelation, where Jesus appears with eyes like fire and a face that shines like the sun. Western Christianity never removed Revelation. It is canonical everywhere, but it gets treated as strange, symbolic, almost a separate genre from the rest of the New Testament. The Ethiopian tradition suggests that strangeness was never an outlier. It was simply what Christians before the 4th century assumed Jesus actually was underneath the human disguise. That raises an obvious question. Why did the rest of Christianity let these texts go? The honest answer is a mix of reasons, and not all of them are comfortable. Part of it was genuinely theological. Books like Enoch spent a lot of time on angelic hierarchies, cosmic geography, and the mechanics of judgment. And some early church leaders worried this pulled attention away from a simpler, Christ-centered message. Part of it was a question of authorship. By the 4th century, most scholars had concluded Enoch was not actually written by the biblical patriarch whose name it carries, and once that was accepted, its authority took a hit. But there is a third factor historians point to as well, one that has nothing to do with whether the texts were accurate and everything to do with how the early church was organizing itself. Texts like Enoch and the Ascension of Isaiah are built around direct visionary experience. Someone is taken up into the heavens, shown hidden things, and reports back. That is a dangerous idea for any institution trying to centralize religious authority, because it implies ordinary people, or at least specially gifted ones, can access divine truth without going through official channels. As the church in Rome and Constantinople consolidated power over the following centuries, texts that emphasize this kind of direct spiritual access were gradually pushed to the margins, while a more manageable, institution-friendly version of Jesus took center stage. Ethiopia, isolated by geography and never absorbed into that same power structure, simply kept copying what it already had. Look at the parallels side by side, and they are hard to dismiss as coincidence. Enoch and Revelation both describe a figure called the Son of Man enthroned in glory. Both describe angelic beings worshiping him. Both describe judgment extended not just to humans, but to rebellious spiritual powers. Both describe a transformation of heaven and earth at the climax of the story. Revelation did not invent this imagery out of nowhere. It was drawing on a much older Jewish apocalyptic tradition that texts like Enoch had already been circulating for centuries before John ever picked up a pen on Patmos. That matters for how you understand the resurrection itself. In the version most people are taught, the resurrection is primarily a personal event. Jesus comes back to prove he is who he said he was, and that guarantees eternal life for anyone who believes. True and central to Christian teaching, but narrow. In the older apocalyptic framework preserved through Ethiopia, the resurrection reads less like a private miracle and more like a rupture in the structure of reality itself. A being who had voluntarily taken on human limitation, breaking back out of it, reclaiming an authority that had simply been veiled rather than absent, and in the process, reordering the relationship between the physical world and whatever lies behind it. The Ascension of Isaiah frames Christ's incarnation as a journey downward through multiple layers of heaven, taking on a diminished form at each level, so as not to overwhelm the beings living there, until he arrives on earth fully human and fully capable of dying. In that framework, the resurrection is simply that descent reversed, and reversed with force. This is where Gibson's project starts to make more sense, even without claiming he pulled directly from Ethiopian sources, which as far as public reporting shows, he has not explicitly said. What he has said on record is that his script begins with the fall of the angels, that it involves a descent into hell, and that the tone is closer to a fever dream than a straightforward historical drama. Those are his own described intentions for the resurrection of the Christ, now split into 2 films releasing on Ascension Day in 2027 and 2028. None of that comes from a plain reading of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. But all of it lines up strikingly well with themes that were common currency in the earliest centuries of Christianity. Themes preserved almost nowhere else in continuous use except in the Ethiopian canon, and in scattered, symbol-heavy corners of the Western Bible like Revelation. Whether Gibson has ever opened a Guizi manuscript is beside the point. What matters is that the vision he is describing did not appear from nowhere. It has ancient roots, and those roots survived best in a tradition most Western audiences have never been taught existed. None of this requires throwing out the gentle, approachable Jesus that most people grew up with. That figure is genuinely present in the Gospels, the one who welcomes children, heals the sick, and teaches about mercy and forgiveness. The compassion is real and it is central. But the Gospels also contain moments that hint at something larger breaking through the human surface, moments that tend to get treated as isolated miracles rather than glimpses of a bigger picture. The Transfiguration, where Jesus' appearance changes, and he radiates light in front of his disciples. The moment in John where he tells religious leaders that he existed before Abraham was even born. The scene in the temple where quiet compassion gives way to physical fury as he overturns tables. Even his prediction of cosmic signs accompanying the end of the age. Western tradition has tended to treat these as proof texts, evidence for a doctrinal point, rather than as consistent hints toward the same cosmic figure described at length in Enoch and the ascension of Isaiah. Put the pieces together, and a more complete picture emerges, one that does not replace the gentle teacher, but sits alongside him. A Jesus who is simultaneously approachable and overwhelming, a figure of mercy and a figure of judgment, someone who can sit at a table with outcasts and, in the same body, hold authority over angels. That combination is uncomfortable, and it is worth being honest about why. A domesticated, manageable Jesus is easier to teach, easier to paint, easier to build an institution around. A cosmic, fire-eyed judge who reshapes reality is a lot harder to fit into a Sunday school lesson plan. Ethiopian Christians never had to make that trade-off, because their canon simply kept both versions in the same book, forcing them to sit in tension rather than picking one. Whether that makes their Bible more accurate is ultimately a theological question people will answer differently depending on their own tradition. And it is worth saying clearly that Ethiopian Christians themselves have never treated the book of Enoch or the ascension of Isaiah as replacing the four Gospels. They sit as additional inspired material within an already Christ-centered faith, not as some secret alternative gospel. But historically, it is hard to argue that these texts were random additions. They were read, quoted, and respected by the earliest generations of Christians, and their disappearance from most modern Bibles says more about the politics and priorities of later centuries than it does about their original standing. So when Mel Gibson describes a resurrection film that starts with falling angels and detours through hell before it ever gets to an empty tomb, the honest response is not that he has gone off script from the Bible. It is that he may be reaching, whether he knows it or not, for a version of the story that used to be far more common than the one most people were handed. Ethiopia kept it alive for 1,700 years, while the rest of the Christian world edited it down to something smaller and easier to hold. Whether Gibson's film actually lands that vision on screen in 2027 remains to be seen. Early scripts and interviews are not the same as a finished film, and Gibson himself has admitted even he was not sure how the finished version would come together. But the questions his project is raising are worth asking on their own terms. What did the earliest Christians actually believe they were describing when they talked about a risen Christ? Was it a quiet miracle in a garden, or something closer to a crack running through the entire structure of reality? Ethiopia never had to choose. Maybe that is the version worth paying attention to.